The family had lunched at 1, and at 1:30 Jenny had carried up the invalid's tray. Miss Emily had fed her, and the tray had gone down at 2. At 2:15 Lydia had brought her basket, too late for lunch, and had been admitted by Jenny, who cautioned her with a gesture that Mr. Lancaster was asleep in the library. As she had gone out by the kitchen door shortly after her sister-in-law arrived, she had not seen the old gentleman again. At 2:30 Mrs. Talbot had gone in, remaining until 3:30, which was when Mrs. Lancaster took her afternoon nap. When she went downstairs she found Mr. Lancaster awake and in the hall, and about to take the brief half-hour saunter which was his daily exercise. Emily had gone downstairs with her, and she had not only seen them out, she had for Mrs. Talbot's benefit shown her that the spring lock was on the front door, and in order. "I'm not afraid of the door," Emily had said. "But I don't like the porch roof off Mother's room, especially just now." "It's a fool idea anyhow," Mr. Lancaster had said. "If a good bank isn't safe, then nothing and nobody is." He and Mrs. Talbot had then gone down the walk to the street together, separating at the pavement, he going left toward Liberty Avenue and Mrs. Talbot going back home. The last thing Emily had said was that she was going to put on a fresh dress, since Margaret intended to go out. This fresh dress we all understood perfectly, since most of us dress before 4 in the afternoon to receive the callers who are more of a tradition of past social importance than present fact. From that time, 3:30 or so, until Miss Emily came in that awful fashion through the side door, no one knew anything of what had happened. Emily had dressed, Miss Margaret had taken or prepared to take her shower, Eben had cut the grass, Ellen had beaten up her cake, Jenny had polished her silver, and up in the hot third floor Peggy had prepared to go out. Not once in all this, however, had anyone mentioned Jim Wellington's name. It was George Talbot who came nearest to it. "It looks like a premeditated thing, all right," he said. Somebody who knew that Mrs. Lancaster always slept at 3:30 and that the girls dressed then. They are, of course, still the girls to us. Also that the old boy always took his walk at that time. He looked around the room mischievously. "Might be any of us," he said, and grinned. Anyone along the crescent, from Jim Wellington at one end to me at the other. Of course he'd have to know the axe was kept in the woodshed, too. That's another point. That isn't funny, said Brian Dalton. Well, even you knew it was there, didn't you, sir? Said George, still grinning. Matter of fact, I saw you near there early this morning. And what were you doing there yourself? Said Mr. Dalton, red with anger. Looking for a golf ball I lost yesterday, said George, smiling and unruffled. And you, sir? That's none of your damned business, Mr. Dalton shouted, and would have continued in the same vein had not his wife hastily risen. Will someone tell my husband, she said sweetly, that it is time to go home? And that I do not like his language? Almost he spoke to her. We all waited breathlessly, for it was common opinion among us that, the ice once broken, they would get along at least amicably. But he remembered in time, gave George an angry glare and stalked out. Mrs. Dalton followed him, tripping on her high heels, and at the foot of the front steps he waited for her. I watched them going side by side down the walk, in their usual silence, but it seemed to me that night that it was less companionable than usual, if a silence can be companionable, or if people can be further separated who are already entirely apart. Chapter 5. Mrs. Talbot remained that night after the others left. Lydia had pleaded fatigue, and so George took her home. Probably the lineup of cars on the street had changed since afternoon, but there were still several there, and the Lancaster house seemed to be lighted from attic to cellar. I knew Mother and Mrs. Talbot were settled for at least an hour, so I slipped on a dark cape in the back hall, and letting myself out the kitchen door, took an inconspicuous route toward Jim Wellington's. This was not the grapevine path the servants use, but one even more remote. Behind all our houses lies a considerable acreage of still unoccupied land, which since the war we have called no man's land. Children used to play in it, but the Crescent frowned on that after some one of us got a baseball through a pantry window. Now it is purely a waste, where George Talbot and sometimes Mr. Dalton practice short golf shots, a waste bordered on one curved side by our properties, on a rather narrow end by the bustle and noise of Liberty Avenue, and directly behind us, but some distance away, the rear yards of the modest houses on Euclid Street. The Talbots' old stable, now a garage for George's dilapidated car, bordered on it, as did the Lancasters' woodshed, our garage and the Daltons', and what was once the Wellington tennis court but was now the weed-grown spot where Helen, to our horror, took sunbathes in a steamer chair and a very scanty bathing suit. She and Jim had no garage. Their car was kept in a garage on Liberty Avenue. This area did not belong to us, of course, but during the process of years we had adopted it as our own. Thus a path led across it and through some trees and an empty lot to Euclid Street, and was used by our servants and sometimes ourselves as a shortcut. Also ebb and burn there are dead leaves in the fall, and even the street cleaners, finding their little carts overfull, had been known to slip back and surreptitiously empty them there, sometimes setting a match to their contents. It was through this wasteland that I made my way that night. Not too comfortably, for there is something about a murder, any murder, that disturbs one's sense of security. However, I had a little light at first. Holmes, our chauffeur, was evidently in his room over the garage, for his windows were fully illuminated, and out in no man's land itself there was still the flicker of a small fire. But beyond the Dalton place I found myself plunged into thick darkness and a silence closed about me which the distant noise on Liberty Avenue did nothing to dispel. Then something caught at my cape and held it, and I stopped dead in my tracks and went cold all over. It was only a briar, but that unexpected stop had done something startling and rather terrible. It had enabled me to hear that someone was close behind me, someone who had stopped just too late to save himself from discovery. I never even turned to look. Pell-mell I ran on, blind with terror, until I fetched up with a crash against the wire netting of the tennis court and there collapsed onto the ground. When I dared to look back it seemed to me that between me and the fire someone was standing and watching, but he made no move and so at last I pulled myself to my feet. It was a picture of demoralization I must have presented to Jim Wellington when, a few minutes later, he himself answered my ring at the door.